You are lying in bed and the sky cracks open. Not gently. A flash floods the room white for half a second, and before your brain even finishes processing the light, your whole body has already flinched. Your heart is pounding before you've consciously registered why. You didn't choose that reaction. Nothing decided to be afraid. Your body simply reacted, the way it has reacted to thunder for longer than you can possibly imagine. But here's the real question. What did your ancestors do in that same moment? Thousands of years before walls, before roofs, before any concept of weather forecasting existed at all? The answer is stranger and more important than you'd expect, because that storm didn't just frighten early humans. It may have helped build them. Start with the obvious part. There was no shelter that could fully block out a storm. No brick walls, no glass windows, no insulated roof holding back the noise and the rain. Early humans experienced thunderstorms with almost nothing standing between their bodies and the raw force of the sky. Picture a small group huddled at the edge of a cave mouth or under a thin canopy of branches, watching lightning rip across the horizon close enough to feel the air change. There was no understanding of electricity. There was no concept of atmospheric pressure. There was just an enormous, violent, completely unexplainable event happening directly above them, again and again, with no warning and no mercy. So what actually happened in their bodies during that moment? This is where the story gets interesting, because the fear response you feel during a thunderstorm today is almost identical, neuron for neuron, to what your earliest ancestors felt. A physiologist named Walter Cannon first described this reaction formally in 1915, coining the term fight or flight to explain how a sudden threat triggers an automatic cascade in the body. Heart rate spikes, blood gets redirected to the muscles, the senses sharpen instantly. None of this requires conscious thought. It happens faster than thought is even possible. Sudden loud noise is one of the most reliable triggers for this reaction in the entire animal kingdom. And thunder is, quite literally, one of the loudest natural sounds that exists on Earth. Your ancestors weren't weak for flinching at it. They were running exactly the program evolution built for exactly this situation. Decades later, a neuroscientist named Joseph Ledoux at New York University mapped out where in the brain this reaction actually lives. His research identified the amygdala, a small almond-shaped structure buried deep in the brain, as the region responsible for triggering fear before the rest of the brain has even finished interpreting what's happening. This matters enormously for understanding thunderstorms specifically, because it means the fear didn't require understanding. Your ancestors didn't need to know what lightning was to be terrified of it. Their amygdala had already sounded the alarm before any explanation could even begin to form, which raises an uncomfortable point. For most of human history, people lived through these events being deeply afraid of something they fundamentally could not explain. And when humans can't explain something terrifying, they tend to do one very specific thing. They build a story around it. Across cultures with zero contact with each other, separated by oceans and centuries, the same explanation kept appearing independently. Storms were not weather. Storms were beings. Zeus hurling lightning from Mount Olympus in ancient Greece, Thor swinging his hammer across the sky in Norse mythology, Indra commanding thunder in ancient Vedic tradition, the Yoruba god Shango controlling storms in West Africa. None of these cultures borrowed the idea from each other. They arrived at almost the exact same explanation independently, over and over, on different continents in different centuries. Why would so many unrelated human groups land on the same answer? Because the human brain doesn't tolerate unexplained danger very well. An anonymous, faceless threat that strikes without warning is psychologically far more distressing than a threat with intention behind it, even an angry one. If a furious god is throwing lightning, there's at least a kind of logic to it. You can pray, you can make an offering, you can behave differently and hope the anger passes. That gives a terrified mind something to do, which is often more important to survival than getting the explanation correct. A wrong answer that lets you take action can be more useful psychologically than no answer at all. Storm gods weren't a failure of ancient intelligence. They were an attempt to convert helplessness into agency. But something else was happening during these storms that had nothing to do with myth and everything to do with survival in the most literal sense. Lightning starts fires. Long before humans had any reliable method of creating fire themselves, a lightning strike hitting dry grass or a dead tree could ignite a blaze that burned for hours or even days. And for early hominins living without the ability to produce fire on demand, a storm wasn't only a terrifying spectacle, it was potentially the single most valuable event that could happen in their entire environment. Archaeological evidence from sites studying early fire use suggests that some of the earliest controlled fire in human history wasn't started by humans at all. It was captured, a group that managed to carry burning embers away from a lightning-struck tree and keep that fire alive for days or weeks, had access to warmth, protection from predators, and cooked food, all sourced from the very storm that had just terrified them. The thing that made them flinch in fear might also be the thing that occasionally saved their lives. Think about how strange that dynamic actually is. The sky opens with violence, and your ancestors are simultaneously terrified and, in some cases, racing toward the danger to retrieve something priceless from it. Fear and opportunity tangled together in the same 15 seconds of lightning and noise. That tension between dread and desperate practical advantage may be one of the oldest emotional contradictions our species ever had to manage. There's a more recent piece of research that adds an unexpected layer to all of this. In 1998, an engineer named Vic Tandy published findings on something called infrasound, sound waves at frequencies too low for human ears to consciously detect. Tandy had noticed unexplained feelings of unease in a particular room, and eventually traced it to a fan generating a low-frequency vibration around 19 Hz, a frequency that, in some people, triggers feelings of dread, anxiety, and even visual disturbance without any conscious awareness of hearing anything at all. Thunderstorms generate exactly this kind of low-frequency rumble, well below what your conscious ears register as sound, which means part of the unease you feel before a storm even fully arrives, that strange heaviness in the air, that sense that something is wrong before you've seen a single flash of lightning, may not be imagination. Your body might be detecting the storm before your senses have technically caught up. Your ancestors almost certainly felt this too, with absolutely no way to explain why they felt uneasy before the rain even started. Now put all of this together, a sudden violent event your ancestors couldn't predict, couldn't control, and couldn't fully explain, arriving with low-frequency warning signs their bodies could detect before their minds understood why, frequently accompanied by a sound loud enough to trigger one of the oldest fear circuits in the brain, and occasionally tangled into all that fear, an opportunity valuable enough to risk approaching the very thing that frightened them. It's no wonder storms became gods. It's no wonder thunder became one of the most consistently mythologized natural events across every inhabited continent on Earth. The storm wasn't just weather to early humans. It was one of the few forces capable of being simultaneously the most frightening and the most useful thing in their entire world. There's a quieter detail in all of this that's easy to miss, but says something important about why humans survived as well as they did. Storms forced groups together. A thunderstorm rolling in meant people stopped whatever they were doing individually and gathered, often physically closer than usual, often in the same sheltered space, waiting it out together. Shared fear, much like shared ritual, tends to strengthen group bonds. Sitting through something frightening alongside other people, watching the same lightning, flinching at the same thunder, builds a kind of unspoken solidarity that scattered individual experience never quite manages. The storm that threatened to kill them may have also, in its own small, repeated way, been quietly knitting them closer together every single time it passed through. So here you are, centuries later, lying in a bed with a roof over your head and walls that will not let the rain in, and the sky cracks open, and your body still flinches before you've thought a single conscious thought. That reaction wasn't installed by your culture. It wasn't taught to you by a movie or a parent telling you storms were dangerous. It is sitting in the same ancient piece of your brain that once watched your ancestors stare up at an unexplainable, godlike fury in the sky and decide, almost against all reason, to run toward it anyway, because somewhere in that terrifying light there might be fire, might be warmth, might be survival. You flinch at thunder for the same reason they did. Some fears are old enough that they were never really about understanding the danger. They were about surviving long enough to one day understand it.